Harlem, 1935. The streets were alive with music, but beneath the jazz and laughter, tension simmered like a hidden flame. 1 week, 8 bodies. And in the eye of this storm stood a man whose reputation stretched far beyond the brownstones and speakeasies of Lenox Avenue. His name, Bumpy Johnson. Dutch Schultz, the notorious gangster with a temper as explosive as his ambition, had crossed a line. An insult thrown in public, a challenge that was not just personal, but a declaration of war. For Bumpy, Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a chessboard, every block a square, every ally and rival a piece in motion. And now, Schultz had threatened the balance. 8 dead in 7 days. Each death a message, each act of violence another warning that the city's underworld was paying attention. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't the type to react with brute force alone. He watched, calculated, and waited. Every glance, every whisper, every shadow on the street corner was data, and in Harlem, knowledge was more lethal than any gun. Tonight, we follow Bumpy through a week that would define him, a week that would pit him against one of the most dangerous men in New York. We'll see the streets he walked, the people who feared him, and the moves he made in silence while the city held its breath. In a world where loyalty is bought and betrayal is currency, Bumpy Johnson stood as both king and protector, navigating a city teetering on chaos. This is Harlem at its rawest, its darkest, and its most unforgiving. And in the middle of it all, one man would prove that power wasn't just about muscle. It was about mind, strategy, and the unshakable will to survive. Tonight, the story begins. Harlem, early 1935. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the faint, lingering notes of a trumpet from a late-night club. On the streets, men in fedoras and women in flapper dresses moved past newsstands plastered with headlines about gang wars in the Bronx and Brooklyn. But in Harlem, the tension was different, quieter, more calculated. People spoke in hushed tones about Bumpy Johnson, the man who had earned respect not just for muscle, but for brains. He wasn't just surviving in a world ruled by Italian mobsters and bootleggers. He was maneuvering through it, mapping every alley, every club, every whisper of betrayal. Bumpy's world was about power, but power was fragile. And that fragility had been exposed by Dutch Schultz, a gangster whose reputation for volatility was matched only by his ambition. Schultz wasn't just anyone. He was the man who had carved out his empire with bullets and threats, a man unafraid to cross lines others wouldn't dare. When he insulted Bumpy in a crowded speakeasy, it wasn't a mere jab, it was a spark in a powder keg. Witnesses later recalled the scene. Schultz, smirking, leaning back in his chair, and Bumpy, calm, studying the room, knotting every loyalist and every potential traitor. The insult hung in the air like smoke, and everyone in the room knew trouble would follow. Harlem's hierarchy was a delicate ecosystem. Italian gangs controlled the numbers, the guns, and the liquor routes, but Bumpy Johnson had something they didn't: influence over the people, respect earned through protection and fairness, and the uncanny ability to anticipate moves before they were made. Schultz underestimated that. He saw a neighborhood under his influence and thought a verbal strike would shake Bumpy's authority. What he didn't realize was that Bumpy's power didn't need to roar. It needed only to move silently, strategically, and with precision. The week that followed was brutal. 8 men dead in 7 days, each victim linked to Schultz's operations in some way. Rumors of betrayal, rivalries, and contracts spread through Harlem faster than any police report. Bumpy didn't panic. Instead, he used the chaos to observe. Every death revealed information: who was loyal, who could be swayed, and who might strike next. In his mind, Harlem wasn't just streets and buildings. It was a living board, and each move, each loss, was a piece falling into place. Even as the bodies piled up, Bumpy maintained his presence in the neighborhood. He walked the streets as if nothing had changed, greeting shopkeepers, nodding to children playing in the alleys, and sitting in clubs that were both his eyes and ears. The tension was palpable. Even those who had once questioned him now moved with caution, aware that one misstep could bring them into the orbit of a man who calculated his moves with surgical precision. And through it all, the insult from Schultz lingered, not as a provocation, but as a catalyst, sharpening Bumpy's focus and forcing him to consider every angle of survival, influence, and retaliation. By the end of that first week, it was clear. Harlem was watching, Schultz had miscalculated, and Bumpy Johnson was preparing for the moves that would define the next chapter of his reign. The streets whispered his name, but the undercurrent was clear. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about power, strategy, and survival in a city that tolerated neither weakness nor hesitation. In Harlem, every glance, every conversation, every shadow mattered, and Bumpy Johnson understood that better than anyone. The week of bloodshed left Harlem on edge. 8 men gone, each one tied in some way to Dutch Schultz's operation, and the city was beginning to understand the stakes. Bumpy Johnson, ever calm and measured, watched from the shadows, letting the chaos unfold while carefully knotting the ripples it created. He knew every alley, every club, every corner where a man could hide or strike. But even more importantly, he knew people, their desires, their fears, their loyalties. In Harlem, loyalty wasn't bought with money alone. It was earned through respect, protection, and a reputation that made betrayal a dangerous gamble. The first real sign of escalation came one evening at the Little Savoy, a jazz club tucked between a brownstone and a bakery. Bumpy had chosen the place deliberately. It was a hub for whispers and rumors, a point where the neighborhood's pulse could be measured. Schultz's men were there, watching, laughing, carrying the arrogance of men who believed force alone ruled the streets. They didn't notice Bumpy sitting near the back, unassuming, sipping on a soda, ears tuned to every word. When a young enforcer approached Schultz to discuss settling scores, Bumpy noted their movements, their timing, their body language, the subtle glances exchanged that betrayed fear underneath bravado. Conflict escalated the next day on a rain-slicked street corner near 135th and Lenox. A car sped by, spraying puddles across the sidewalk, and inside, Schultz's men had been following a rumored informant linked to Bumpy's operations. They fired into the night, bullets cracking against brick and metal, leaving one man dead. A warning, a message, a calculated strike meant to intimidate. But Bumpy Johnson had already anticipated this move. He was nowhere near the street, yet he had instructed trusted allies to monitor the location, to predict Schultz's patterns, and to ensure that the fallout would strengthen his position rather than weaken it. The death became a chess piece, shifting influence back toward Bumpy without a single step taken by him in the chaos itself. Meanwhile, Schultz's arrogance only grew. He believed Harlem could be intimidated, that one week of bodies would rattle a neighborhood long loyal to Bumpy. But the reality was different. Residents whispered of Bumpy's calm demeanor, of the way he walked through streets where bullets had flown and men had died, unmoved and unflinching. "He knows more than we do," one bar owner told a friend in the dim light of a backroom. "He sees the game before it even starts." It was true. Every threat, every insult, every death was feeding into a larger picture that only Bumpy could fully comprehend. The tension reached a breaking point when Schultz attempted a direct move against Bumpy's associates. A meeting was arranged at a Harlem storefront, ostensibly to negotiate, but clearly designed as a trap. Schultz's men arrived armed, ready to assert dominance. Bumpy, aware of the setup, approached as though he were stepping into routine business. His eyes scanned the room, noting every weapon, every potential ally, every sign of hesitation. Words were exchanged, sharp, pointed, calm. But underneath the veneer of civility, both sides understood the true stakes. Schultz wanted control, but Bumpy had something Schultz couldn't buy. Harlem itself, a community that protected its own, and a mind that never panicked, even in the face of violence. By the week's end, the city was transformed. Schultz's name carried weight, yes, but Bumpy's reputation had solidified. The violence had been a crucible, exposing weakness, loyalty, and miscalculations. And through it all, Bumpy remained the eye of the storm, moving deliberately, watching, listening, calculating. Every death, every insult, every misstep by Schultz only tightened the net, and Harlem knew, whether whispered in darkened hallways or shouted across crowded streets, that Bumpy Johnson was not a man to be underestimated. The battle was far from over, but one truth had become undeniable. In the chessboard of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was already thinking 5 moves ahead. As the tension in Harlem reached its peak, Bumpy Johnson knew the time for observation had passed. Schultz's provocations were no longer abstract threats. They were direct assaults on his network and the very streets he had sworn to protect. The insults and violence had created a web of fear and confusion among both allies and rivals. Bumpy understood that in a city like Harlem, hesitation was as dangerous as bullets, and strategy was the only true shield. Every move from Schultz had been loud, aggressive, and obvious, perfectly predictable for a man who had spent years reading human behavior as if it were a map. Bumpy's first step was consolidation. He moved quietly, reaching out to his most trusted men and neighbors, not with threats but with reassurance. "We watch, we wait, and when it's time, we act," he told them in a low, steady voice. There was no bravado, no show of force, just the calm authority of someone who understood that fear could be wielded as effectively as a gun. He ensured that every lookout, every informant, and every business owner within his influence knew where their loyalties should lie. Harlem responded not out of fear alone, but out of recognition that Bumpy had their interests at heart, unlike Schultz, whose ambition disregarded everything but his own power. The turning point came with intelligence that Schultz planned a more aggressive strike against one of Bumpy's closest allies, a move meant to destabilize his influence. Bumpy did not confront Schultz directly. He never did when patience could serve him better than reaction. Instead, he orchestrated a subtle countermeasure, leveraging informants and loyalists who had been strategically placed throughout Harlem. They tracked Schultz's movements, noting the timing of shipments, the location of his enforcers, and the routines of his closest men. By the time Schultz's team arrived at a Harlem warehouse intending to intimidate and kill, they found nothing but shadows and silence, a city already aware, a neighborhood protected not by brute force but by foresight. Bumpy's strategy relied on anticipation. Every move Schultz made revealed his patterns, his arrogance, and his impatience. Bumpy capitalized on this, using Schultz's aggression to his advantage, turning each act of violence into an opportunity to strengthen his own position. Harlem was not just a backdrop to these maneuvers, it was a living participant. Business owners, bartenders, and ordinary citizens became eyes and ears, feeding information, shifting alliances, and quietly tipping the balance in favor of the man who had earned their trust. By the end of these maneuvers, Schultz's men were left frustrated and exposed, their momentum broken not by bullets, but by the meticulous and patient orchestration of Bumpy Johnson. The climax of this turning point was quiet, almost imperceptible. Schultz had anticipated confrontation, but what he hadn't anticipated was the absence of direct opposition. Each failed strike, each miscalculated attack, slowly eroded his confidence. Meanwhile, Bumpy moved seamlessly among Harlem streets, visiting clubs, greeting residents, and maintaining a presence that was reassuring to allies and intimidating to enemies. No dramatic showdown was necessary. The streets themselves spoke. Schultz's power, built on intimidation and brute force, had begun to crumble under the weight of strategy, patience, and the unshakable reputation of a man who never let the city see him panic. By the time the week closed, Bumpy Johnson had not only survived the initial wave of attacks, but had turned the situation in his favor. Harlem had witnessed a quiet revolution of influence. Schultz's moves had become predictable, his enforcers uncertain, and the people of the neighborhood aligned firmly with Bumpy. The insult that had started it all now seemed almost insignificant against the reality that had been established. Harlem had its protector, a man whose intellect, foresight, and calm authority had outmaneuvered one of the most dangerous gangsters in New York. And as the city exhaled, the undercurrent was clear. Bumpy Johnson was not just surviving, he was defining the rules of the streets. By the end of that fateful week, Harlem streets carried a new rhythm, a tense, measured cadence that spoke of fear, respect, and a recalibrated balance of power. The 8 bodies had been counted, the streets had whispered their stories, and the people of the neighborhood had seen firsthand the consequences of challenging Bumpy Johnson. But unlike Schultz's reign, which relied on loud threats and public displays of force, Bumpy's authority had been cemented quietly, invisibly, through intellect, strategy, and an almost surgical manipulation of the urban chessboard he called home. Schultz's anger had blinded him, and Bumpy had used it against him. Every move made by the Italian gangster revealed not only his hunger for dominance, but also his impatience and inability to anticipate the subtleties of Harlem's social fabric. Bumpy's response had been deliberate. No confrontation in the open, no rash retaliation. Instead, he had leveraged information, loyalty, and reputation, allowing Schultz to make the mistakes that would weaken his influence while strengthening Bumpy. Residents who might have been caught in the crossfire were now aligned firmly with their protector, and the streets themselves had become an extension of Bumpy's strategy. One of the key victories in this week-long battle wasn't measured in bodies or bullets, but in perception. Schultz had intended to humiliate, to assert that Harlem could be intimidated, that Bumpy Johnson was just another gangster to be cajoled or crushed. But by the final day, it was Schultz who appeared uncertain, his men hesitant, their movements cautious under the weight of surveillance and unseen eyes. The insult that had begun this chain of events, the words spoken loudly in a crowded club, now seemed to have backfired spectacularly. Bumpy's calm had become his weapon, his ability to see 5 moves ahead, rendering Schultz's aggression ineffective. In private corners of Harlem, conversations shifted. Shopkeepers, bartenders, and even rival gang members acknowledged the shift in power. "He sees everything," one longtime resident remarked quietly to a friend, glancing toward a shadowed doorway where Bumpy often lingered. "It's like he knows what's coming before it does." That reputation, carefully cultivated through a week of careful observation and subtle maneuvers, ensured that Bumpy's influence extended far beyond his immediate circle. The Italian mob had learned a lesson in humility, and Harlem's residents had witnessed the rare power of a man who ruled without flaunting violence at every turn. The week closed with Harlem settling into a fragile calm, but the implications of the events were far-reaching. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated that intelligence, patience, and control over information could triumph over sheer aggression and intimidation. Schultz had overplayed his hand, and in doing so, had unwittingly solidified the authority of the man he sought to undermine. For Bumpy, the outcome was more than survival, it was a statement. Harlem would not bend to outsiders, whims, and the streets would not forget the man who had defended them not with a rash display of power, but with strategy, foresight, and an unshakable command of the game. As the neighborhood exhaled from the tension, the narrative of Harlem's underworld was forever changed. 8 men dead, 1 gangster humiliated, and 1 protector's legend quietly, inexorably growing. Bumpy Johnson had turned insult into opportunity, chaos into control, and threat into a demonstration of intellect over muscle. Harlem had witnessed the calm in the eye of the storm, and the message was clear to anyone daring enough to challenge the streets again. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just surviving, he was orchestrating the game, and in his hands, the city's power had a new master. Harlem's rhythm in 1935 had shifted, but the undercurrents of danger never truly disappeared. Even as Bumpy Johnson solidified his position against Dutch Schultz, The streets remained a volatile stage where alliances were fragile and betrayal could appear without warning. The tension from the previous week had taught everyone one lesson. In Harlem, power was measured as much by intellect as it was by firepower. And Bumpy, ever calm, had proven that foresight and strategy could outmaneuver even the most notorious gangster in New York. But his victory, though decisive, was only the beginning. The following weeks revealed just how delicate the balance of power truly was. Schultz, humiliated but not defeated, began regrouping, seeking to regain some measure of control over his empire. His attempts, however, were cautious. The previous encounters had exposed vulnerabilities, and his men were no longer the fearless enforcers they had been. Bumpy understood this. He recognized that Schultz's pride would not allow him to retreat quietly, that the Italian gangster would continue to push, probing for weaknesses. And so Bumpy's next moves were not reactive, they were preemptive. Every action, every conversation, every subtle observation of Schultz's men became part of a larger strategy to maintain Harlem's stability while keeping his rivals uncertain and off balance. It was during this time that Bumpy began consolidating his influence over key allies and neutral figures in Harlem. Business owners who had previously remained on the sidelines were drawn closer, not by intimidation, but by trust. He ensured that those who ran the neighborhood's clubs, speakeasies, and social halls understood the unspoken rule. Loyalty to Bumpy was rewarded, disloyalty carried consequences that extended beyond mere threats. By embedding himself within the community, Bumpy created a network of intelligence and support that was invisible to outsiders, a silent system that allowed him to anticipate Schultz's moves and respond with precision before violence could erupt. The tension escalated one evening when Schultz attempted a subtle incursion into Harlem, sending a small team of enforcers to test Bumpy's network. The men were armed, confident, and unaware of the watchful eyes tracking their every step. As they moved through the streets, they encountered nothing overt, no confrontation, no immediate threat. But they began noticing anomalies, doors that opened too quickly, shadows that seemed to follow, familiar faces suddenly in unfamiliar places. By the time they reached their intended target, the entire operation had been quietly observed, documented, and relayed back to Bumpy. When the Italian gang returned to regroup, it was clear that the neighborhood had shifted. The city, once a battleground for intimidation, had become a maze that Bumpy navigated effortlessly. Bumpy's strategy during this period was subtle yet profoundly effective. Rather than engaging in direct conflict, he manipulated perception. Schultz's men began to doubt their own actions, questioning whether they had been seen or followed, unsure of which allies could be trusted. Harlem itself became a weapon, its streets, its residents, its rhythms serving as extensions of Bumpy's mind. In this chess game, every pedestrian glance, every whispered conversation, every familiar face became a move in an invisible game that Schultz could not fully understand. Bumpy's intelligence, patience, and calm authority were his true arsenal, turning fear into a tool and uncertainty into leverage. By the end of these maneuvers, Bumpy had not only defended his territory, but also extended his influence. Harlem's residents, his allies, and even rival factions recognized that he was the force that dictated the neighborhood's rules. Schultz's reputation, once feared, was now tarnished by miscalculations and failed strikes. The Italian gangster had underestimated a man whose strength was not measured by violence alone, but by understanding, strategy, and the ability to turn aggression against those who wielded it. Harlem had witnessed a quiet transformation. A protector had become a strategist, a neighborhood had become a fortress, and Bumpy Johnson had once again proven that intellect and foresight could triumph where brute force failed. As 1935 pressed on, Harlem was alive with a tension that could be felt in every dimly lit alley, in every jazz-filled club, and in the quiet murmurs of shopkeepers who had learned to measure their words. Bumpy Johnson's earlier maneuvers against Dutch Schultz had established him as a force to be reckoned with, but the streets of Harlem offered no permanent peace. Power, as Bumpy knew, was never static. It was a living, breathing thing, vulnerable to challenge, betrayal, or sudden violence. And Schultz, humiliated yet relentless, was already plotting his next moves. Bumpy understood that surviving in Harlem was more than controlling territory. It was controlling information. Each conversation he overheard, each delivery boy, each bartender who served him or his associates, became a source of insight. Schultz's attempts to infiltrate the neighborhood, to undermine Bumpy's authority, were met with subtle yet devastating countermeasures. Surveillance replaced confrontation, observation replaced gunfire, and anticipation replaced reaction. The Italian gangsters' men, once bold and brazen, now moved cautiously, their uncertainty evident in every step. Harlem itself seemed to shift in response, a silent ally to the man who had earned its trust. Tension escalated when a shipment of liquor, central to Schultz's operations, was intercepted in Harlem. It was a calculated move, executed not with overt violence but with precision, signaling to Schultz that his every action was being watched. Rumors of the interception spread quickly, unsettling Schultz's men. "How does he know?" one of the enforcers asked quietly, glancing around as if the walls themselves might be listening. The answer was clear. Bumpy's influence ran deeper than guns or intimidation. It was embedded in the rhythm of the streets, in the people who walked them, and in the silent intelligence network he had nurtured over years. Bumpy's approach was methodical. Each small victory, each carefully executed maneuver, reinforced his authority and weakened Schultz's credibility. By avoiding direct confrontation, he forced his rival to act recklessly, to overextend, and to reveal vulnerabilities. Schultz had underestimated Harlem, not just the streets, but the people who lived there and the man who commanded their loyalty. Bumpy's strategy turned Schultz's aggression into a tool, a way to map weaknesses, test alliances, and tighten control without ever firing a shot himself. Every misstep by Schultz further validated Bumpy's foresight, earning him not only respect, but an almost mythical reputation among Harlem's residents and rival gang factions alike. The streets themselves became a canvas for Bumpy's strategy. Night after night, he walked through Harlem as if surveying a living organism, noting the behavior of allies, the presence of Schultz's men, and the subtle signs of potential betrayal. In clubs, he exchanged greetings, listened to conversations, and observed the subtleties of body language that could reveal hidden intentions. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the fear and uncertainty brewing in Schultz's camp. By the end of each week, the Italian gangster was reacting to Bumpy's moves, rather than dictating the tempo of the neighborhood, a reversal of power that spoke volumes in a world built on aggression and intimidation. As the weeks unfolded, it became clear that Harlem was no longer just a battleground. It was a fortress under Bumpy's command. Schultz's plans, once bold and decisive, were slowed, scrutinized, and ultimately neutralized before they could come to fruition. Bumpy Johnson had transformed the streets into both shield and weapon, using strategy, perception, and influence to outmaneuver a rival who relied solely on brute force. The neighborhood watched silently as the chessboard shifted, and one lesson became undeniable. In Harlem, intellect could dominate muscle, patience could outlast aggression, and a man like Bumpy Johnson could redefine what it meant to wield power in the shadows of the city. Harlem in 1935 had become a study in contrasts. On the surface, life carried on. Children played in the alleys, jazz poured from the clubs, and shopkeepers tended their businesses. But beneath that veneer, a quiet war simmered. Dutch Schultz had not given up, but every attempt to assert dominance over Bumpy Johnson's territory was met with invisible resistance. Schultz's aggression, once bold and unchecked, was now tentative, cautious, a reflection of a man who had begun to realize that Harlem's streets were no longer his to intimidate. Bumpy's intelligence network had become the backbone of his power. Every block had an observer, every club a listener, every street corner a calculated vantage point. It wasn't just about survival. It was about shaping the environment itself, guiding decisions, and ensuring that Harlem's residents remained aligned with him. Even neutral figures, those who might have supported Schultz for personal gain, found themselves wary, sensing that Bumpy's reach extended far beyond immediate violence. He had turned the neighborhood into a living chessboard, where every pawn, rook, and knight moved according to his vision, even if those pieces were unaware of their roles. Conflict reached a new level when Schultz attempted to coerce one of Bumpy's key allies, a nightclub owner who had provided critical intelligence about the Italian gangsters' movements. Schultz's men arrived under the cover of night, confident that fear alone would bend the man to their will. But Bumpy had anticipated this. Through a network of loyal eyes, he knew of the plan hours in advance. Instead of meeting aggression with aggression, he orchestrated a series of diversions, false deliveries, shadowy figures in alleyways, whispers of police surveillance, that left Schultz's men disoriented and uncertain. When they attempted to confront the target, they found nothing but empty rooms and the faint echo of footsteps that were never there. The failure was complete, and Schultz's frustration was palpable. Bumpy's mastery lay not in guns or physical dominance, but in anticipation and perception. By forcing Schultz into repeated miscalculations, he undermined not just the Italian gangster's confidence, but the loyalty of his own men. Fear is a fragile motivator. Uncertainty makes it crumble. Schultz's crew began second-guessing orders, questioning each other's reliability and even hesitating in public. Meanwhile, Bumpy's influence grew steadily. Harlem's residents recognized a man who could protect, a man who could outthink, a man whose calm command brought security to streets that had long been governed by unpredictability and violence. The climax of this chapter came in the quiet moments of observation rather than through a dramatic shootout. Bumpy walked Harlem at night, nodding to familiar faces, observing patterns, and ensuring that loyalty was reinforced through trust, not fear alone. Schultz's movements were now predictable. Each action he took seemed to play directly into Bumpy's strategy. By manipulating perception, controlling information, and subtly directing the rhythm of the neighborhood, Bumpy transformed what could have been chaos into control. The streets whispered his name not in fear of bloodshed, but in acknowledgement of a mind that could outmaneuver a rival at every turn. By the end of these maneuvers, Harlem had shifted irrevocably. Schultz's arrogance had been checked, his aggression neutralized, and his men demoralized. Bumpy Johnson, calm and unshaken, had used strategy, foresight, and influence to turn threat into opportunity and aggression into a demonstration of his intelligence. The neighborhood had been tested, alliances reaffirmed, and the balance of power redefined. In the quiet of Harlem's night, one truth had become undeniable. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to fight loudly to win. He simply needed to think, anticipate, and move with the confidence of a man who understood that intellect, patience, and strategy were the ultimate weapons in a city ruled by violence. As the months of 1935 unfolded, Harlem settled into a tense equilibrium, but the undercurrents of threat never truly disappeared. Dutch Schultz, strung by repeated failures and public humiliation, was no longer a reckless aggressor. He was a calculating one, seeking subtle ways to undermine Bumpy Johnson without repeating the mistakes that had cost him so dearly. For Bumpy, this was an opportunity as much as a challenge. He had demonstrated his ability to anticipate Schultz's moves, but he also knew that in the world of organized crime, resting on past victories was as dangerous as ignoring a rival entirely. Bumpy began to expand his intelligence network, deepening ties with the community and key figures within Harlem's clubs, speakeasies, and businesses. Every interaction became a source of information. Every casual conversation, every nod or glance could reveal loyalties and intentions. His influence extended beyond the visible streets, infiltrating corners of the neighborhood where Schultz had hoped to operate undetected. Allies reported movements, suspicious encounters, and signs of betrayal, feeding Bumpy a continuous stream of intelligence. In Harlem, knowledge had become the most potent weapon, and Bumpy wielded it with precision. The tension reached a critical point when Schultz attempted another indirect strike. A shipment of valuable liquor, essential to his operations, was rerouted through Harlem in a covert attempt to lure Bumpy into a confrontation. The plan was simple on the surface: provoke a reaction, create chaos, and force Bumpy into a public display of force that could be exploited for Schultz's gain. But Bumpy had already anticipated the move. His trusted network identified the shipment, observed its handlers, and ensured that the Italian gangster's men would find nothing amiss when they arrived. The trap, meant to unsettle, ended up highlighting Bumpy's superior foresight and control. Schultz had acted. Bumpy had simply absorbed the action, letting the rival's own schemes expose weakness. Bumpy's genius during this period was not in confrontation, but in perception management. By controlling what Schultz could see, hear, and understand, he forced the Italian gangster to operate in a state of uncertainty. Every attempt by Schultz to assert dominance backfired, leaving his men frustrated and his operations compromised. Meanwhile, Bumpy strengthened his alliances, reinforcing loyalty not through fear, but through the demonstration of his ability to protect and strategize. Harlem's residents, observing the quiet shifts in power, grew increasingly aligned with Bumpy, recognizing that his calm authority was a far more reliable safeguard than the bluster of a man like Schultz. The city itself seemed to bend under Bumpy's influence. Streets that had once been battlegrounds for intimidation became arenas of calculated control, where information flowed faster than violence. Schultz's attempts to undermine Bumpy exposed not just his arrogance, but the limits of aggression without insight. By the end of these maneuvers, the Italian gangster had been forced into cautious inaction, his authority weakened, and his confidence diminished. Harlem, meanwhile, had witnessed a subtle transformation. A neighborhood that had feared chaos now recognized the steady hand guiding it. In the quiet aftermath, Bumpy Johnson's reputation had grown beyond the streets themselves. Allies, rivals, and even those who had remained neutral acknowledged the shift. He had demonstrated that intellect, strategy, and foresight could triumph over raw aggression. Schultz, though still dangerous, had learned that brute force alone could not dictate outcomes in Harlem. And Bumpy, ever calm and deliberate, had proven that a man's greatest weapon was not the gun he carried, but the mind he wielded. The chessboard of Harlem had been reset, and the message was unmistakable. In a city defined by violence, Bumpy Johnson's control was both absolute and invisible, an unyielding force shaping the streets with every calculated step. The shadow of Dutch Schultz still loomed over Harlem, but by mid-1935 it had grown thinner, stretched taut by repeated miscalculations and Bumpy Johnson's relentless foresight. Schultz's initial arrogance had cost him influence, and now every move he made was hesitant, measured, but even hesitation could be dangerous in the underworld. Bumpy knew that complacency was not an option. Survival and control in Harlem demanded constant vigilance, continuous assessment of allies and adversaries, and the ability to turn any action against those who would challenge him. It was during this time that a subtle but significant threat emerged. Schultz, unwilling to let his humiliation go unanswered, began quietly cultivating disgruntled figures within Harlem, men who felt overlooked, who had once considered loyalty to Bumpy optional. These men were promised rewards, power, and protection if they shifted allegiance. Bumpy, however, had anticipated such overtures. His network, refined and expansive, intercepted the whispers before they could crystallize into action. Trusted lieutenants quietly spoke to potential defectors, not with threats, but with reminders of the tangible benefits of loyalty and the inherent dangers of betrayal. In Harlem, loyalty was a currency, and Bumpy ensured that it remained valuable and respected. Conflict escalated when Schultz attempted to assert influence over a Harlem nightclub that had been a focal point for information and community gatherings. His men arrived under the guise of negotiation, but the intention was clear: intimidate, coerce, and weaken Bumpy's presence. Yet Bumpy had already positioned allies in strategic locations, ensuring that the move would fail without a direct confrontation. Schultz's men found themselves navigating a neighborhood that seemed to shift around them. Doors opened to nowhere, familiar faces appeared unexpectedly, and whispered warnings reached their ears at the precise moment needed to sow doubt. Their carefully planned intimidation crumbled into confusion, reinforcing Bumpy's reputation as a man whose awareness extended beyond what the eye could see. Bumpy's brilliance lay not in responding with force, but in engineering perception. Every failure by Schultz's men, every misstep, was amplified through observation and subtle manipulation. Harlem itself became a reflection of Bumpy's strategy, an environment where even the boldest acts of aggression were anticipated, analyzed, and neutralized. Schultz, who had once commanded fear through violence alone, was now forced to operate in uncertainty, each action potentially triggering unseen consequences. Meanwhile, Bumpy reinforced his connections, quietly rewarding loyalty, ensuring the streets remained aligned with him, and confirming that the neighborhood's allegiance was rooted in respect, not fear. The climax of this period was almost imperceptible, a testament to Bumpy's strategic mind. Schultz's influence had been steadily eroded, his operations slowed, and his men demoralized, yet no single dramatic battle marked the shift. Instead, it was the cumulative effect of foresight, information control, and subtle manipulation that tilted the balance. Harlem had been transformed from a potential battleground into a controlled environment where Bumpy's authority reigned. Allies and residents alike had internalized a simple truth: while Schultz wielded aggression, Bumpy wielded strategy, patience, and knowledge, the most lethal combination in a city where trust and loyalty were fragile commodities. By the close of this chapter, the narrative of power in Harlem had shifted unmistakably. Bumpy Johnson's reputation was no longer simply that of a protector or a feared figure. It had become synonymous with intelligence, foresight, and control over the seemingly chaotic streets. Schultz's failures, silent and subtle as they were, echoed across the neighborhood, reinforcing Bumpy's influence and solidifying the understanding that in Harlem, it was not the loudest gun, but the sharpest mind that dictated the rules. And as the neighborhood exhaled, ever watchful of threats, one undeniable fact remained: Bumpy Johnson had redefined power in Harlem, turning conflict, insult, and danger into a testament of strategy over force. By late 1935, Harlem had become a neighborhood defined as much by strategy as by survival. The week of deaths, insults, and subtle confrontations had cemented Bumpy Johnson's status not just as a gangster, but as the orchestrator of the streets. Dutch Schultz, once feared for his violent unpredictability, had been neutralized not through a single act of force, but through patience, foresight, and an intimate understanding of the neighborhood's dynamics. Each failure of Schultz's men, each miscalculated move, had quietly reinforced Bumpy's authority. Harlem's residents, from shopkeepers to musicians, understood that the streets were watched, guided, and protected by a man whose intelligence rivaled any rival's firepower. The final escalation of the conflict unfolded in the subtleties of influence rather than an open clash. Schultz attempted to manipulate the loyalties of Harlem's smaller operators, promising rewards and protection for defection. Yet Bumpy had already woven a network of loyalty that extended far beyond his immediate circle. Trusted lieutenants intercepted these overtures, not through intimidation, but through reassurance and the quiet demonstration of past reliability. Potential defectors realized that shifting allegiance would not only weaken their safety, but also compromise opportunities they had within Bumpy's sphere. Loyalty, Bumpy understood, was strongest when rooted in respect and tangible security, not fear. A defining moment occurred one night near a jazz club that had long served as a hub for intelligence gathering. Schultz's men, attempting to assert pressure on a key ally of Bumpy's, arrived armed and confident, but the streets themselves seemed to conspire against them. Familiar faces appeared unexpectedly, shadows moved where none should have been, and whispers of surveillance spread just enough to create uncertainty. Confusion took root. Schultz's men hesitated, debated, and ultimately withdrew without confrontation. What could have been a violent escalation instead became a demonstration of Bumpy's mastery over perception, influence, and foresight. Every failure of his rival reinforced the message. In Harlem, aggression alone was powerless against strategy. Bumpy's genius during this period lay in his ability to control the narrative without ever drawing attention to his hand. Schultz's continued attempts to regain dominance were systematically undermined through observation, subtle intimidation, and the reinforcement of loyalty among the community. Harlem itself became an extension of Bumpy's mind, a neighborhood where every ally, every street corner, and every public interaction fed information into a network that allowed him to predict threats, mitigate risks, and manipulate outcomes. Violence remained a tool, but one wielded sparingly. Intellect and anticipation were the true weapons. By the end of the year, the week that had begun with 8 deaths and a public insult had transformed into a lasting demonstration of Bumpy Johnson's authority. Schultz's empire in Harlem had been challenged, weakened, and redirected without a single large-scale confrontation. The neighborhood, once tense and uncertain, now operated under a quiet but undeniable order. Bumpy's reputation as a strategist, protector, and master of influence had been solidified. Harlem understood that the balance of power favored a man who could see the game in its entirety, manipulate perception, and guide outcomes with precision. The lesson was clear to all who lived and operated there. In a city built on violence, the sharpest mind often carried more weight than the deadliest gun, and Bumpy Johnson had proven himself the undisputed master of both. Harlem in 1935 had survived a week of violence, insults, and calculated chaos, but the legacy of those events stretched far beyond the streets. Bumpy Johnson had faced one of New York's most feared gangsters, not with reckless force, but with strategy, foresight, and a calm that unsettled even the most hardened men. Dutch Schultz had underestimated him, and in doing so, had exposed the limits of aggression when confronted by intellect and influence. Harlem had witnessed a masterclass in control, the quiet assertion of authority, the orchestration of loyalty, and the subtle reshaping of power. Bumpy's triumph wasn't measured in bodies or bullets, but in perception and respect. The neighborhood had aligned itself under a protector whose reach extended into every corner, whose mind anticipated threats before they materialized, and whose presence alone commanded obedience and trust. The streets, once chaotic and unpredictable, now bore the mark of a man who understood that true power is earned, maintained, and respected without unnecessary spectacle. As the lights of Harlem flickered in the evening, one truth was undeniable. Bumpy Johnson had redefined what it meant to survive and to thrive in a city governed by danger. His story serves as a reminder that in the shadowed corners of history, strategy can triumph over brute force and intellect can outlast fear. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Every week, we dive into the streets, secrets, and untold power struggles that shaped history. Join us and discover the minds behind the legends, one story at a time.